Let us imagine together that you are sitting now in a caravan in the middle of the desert. You have no internet, you do not have any way to entertain yourself, and at the same time you do not have any phone to use, and all you have is a cup of water, a pen, and a small notebook. Also imagine with me that you are sitting in this place for a while. 3 days. The important question that I want to ask you now is, would you be able to bear sitting in this place for 3 days? Okay, if I asked you to stay in this place for a week. Okay, if I asked you to live in this place for at least a very long time? 6 months. So, imagine if I told you that you would stay in this place for the rest of your life. The question that may come to your mind now is, what is the return for all of this? I wonder what I will gain from doing this, and the answer to this question is nothing. You will not gain anything from doing this experiment. Let me ask you now. I hope you tell me in the comments. You will be able to try any of these experiments for free. After you answer this question, let me tell you the main reason that prevents most people from doing any of these experiments, whether it is for 3 days, a week, 6 months, or a lifetime. And the answer that I will give you is now. It is a simple answer, and it can be summed up in just one word, which is pleasure. Pleasure is what shapes a person's life, especially in the materialistic age that we live in now, but the extent of pleasure's control over a person, it depends on how a person is attracted to a certain thing and how he controls this thing. He wastes time, effort, and focus instead of exploiting them in order to be able to produce something useful. In this episode, we will talk about pleasure. We will talk about how a person can overcome a very terrible problem called sensory overload. Sensory overload. We will talk in detail about this idea, and we will know what this idea has to do with what is called dopamine detox, or getting rid of dopamine. The main goal of all of this is that we know the steps that help us regain control of our lives. It is a chemical substance that is present inside the human body and is secreted naturally. There are some people who think that dopamine is considered a hormone, but in fact dopamine is considered a neurotransmitter, but at the same time it does some things. Functions of hormones. Dopamine is considered a neurotransmitter found inside the brain. It is secreted naturally and sends nerve signals between cells. Dopamine has many benefits from a biological standpoint, such as movement, memory, the mood state of humans, and learning. Dopamine, as we said, may be classified as a hormone, even though it is not a hormone because it plays a very important role in balancing blood pressure in humans and helps with kidney function and insulin production. Medical research also says that there is a relationship between dopamine in humans and between neurological diseases such as mental illness and some other diseases such as Parkinson's disease, which are the result of you losing dopamine and therefore affected in regions the nervous system that produces what are called neurons or nerve cells, and for this reason, healthy dopamine levels in humans vary from person to person. The things we mentioned now are very important things and express the functions of dopamine, but the main thing and what affects humans directly is that dopamine is described as it or the substance. The chemical responsible for pleasure in humans. The important thing that we must know and what we must take good care of is that dopamine itself is not the substance that makes a person feel pleasure, but it is a chemical substance that stimulates a person. He begins to search for things that make him enjoy the various activities that make him enjoy. He feels joy in the modern world in which we live. Companies use dopamine as a means to steal your focus. As a consumer, your attention is worth money to them. When we talk about companies here, we do not mean ordinary companies. It is not any company that sells you any product. It is a company that tries to control the dopamine you have. You can say to me, all companies are trying to get my attention, but fields for you here are that the companies that the writer means are social media companies like TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, and other different applications that are trying to get only one thing, which is your attention, because as we said, for them, attention is worth money to the person who is trying to consume social media, or even the person who is trying to if he produces content on it. He is always in a state of suspense. He is always on the lookout for follows, likes, and various comments, and he is always looking for what is called social media, or what we might call social validation or social support. The idea is that you are looking for support from the people around you, no matter how many people there are, and what is happening there. This process is the activation of the so-called reward centers. These centers are the centers that are present inside the human brain and which are responsible for the secretion of dopamine, which in turn makes you get something positive. You get pleasure. You then feel a certain feeling. This feeling is like euphoria, which you always want to get on an ongoing basis. The problem here is that you enter into a cycle called reward-seeking behavior, and you become a state of addiction because you are searching for euphoria on an ongoing basis, and the biggest problem is that this addictive behavior prevents you from focusing on the important tasks that you must accomplish. Social media applications use what is called a variable reward schedule. The idea here is that the user gets a reward, but this reward is different every time, and every time it is unexpected, and that is why different social media outlets use different algorithms in order to be able to design each one of us with a variable reward system that will always leave him in a state of continuous addiction to the need he consumes. This topic can even reach the point because you can become addicted to following useful content, watching useful content, on the people you love who are supposed to be useful to you, but you don't do anything by following up. You are just a spectator consuming content, and you do not apply this content in your life because this content is the same thing that prevents you from focusing on the main thing that you have. This problem makes a person always search for different inputs, which then causes him to have a sensory overload or sensory overload. The more dopamine is secreted in humans, the human body always needs a very high level of dopamine in order to be able to lead a normal life, and the issue can reach very dangerous levels. You are addicted to things that can be very harmful to you, such as if you are watching pornographic films that contain a high percentage of dopamine, much greater than dopamine, which is secreted from any another thing motivates you, and the biggest problem in all of this is that you are getting bored from the slightest thing. The video that you are watching right now, you probably want to close it because you do not feel the same level of pleasure that you would get from a laughing video or if you were watching pornographic films or anything that makes you feel that you are always in a state of constant ecstasy. And if we want to use one word to describe this whole problem, then that word is anticipation. You are always in a state of anticipation and always searching for pleasure, and you cannot stop anticipating the need that will please you after that. At the end of the part 1, strongly advise you to watch a very important documentary film that was produced in the year 2020 called This Social Media Always talks about this movie in detail, and from the people who invented the most important applications that we use, how to control us, detox a dopamine, or what is called getting rid of dopamine, which some people call dopamine fasting. Dopamine is your attempt to remove all activities that supply your dopamine and thus reduce sensory overload or overload. Sensory, the idea of dopamine fasting or getting rid of dopamine is an idea of the psychologist Cameron Seba. This man made the idea of dopamine fasting a very widespread and famous idea, to the point that this idea became very famous and the term dopamine detox became one of the very famous terms, especially in the Western world. But the writer says that the idea of dopamine detox, or the idea of getting rid of dopamine or dopamine fasting, is a phrase that might make you think that the problem is in the dopamine itself. But the main problem is that you are greatly exposed to external influences. And these influences are what provide what is called the sensory emote or sensory input. which in turn greatly increases the level of dopamine in humans, is what makes a person feel that he is unable to interact with the environment around him and is unable to be stimulated by the simple things that he does in order to reach his goals in the long term. And among the important needs that you must know, the idea of getting rid of dopamine is one of the things that can help you, but it is not something you do all at once and it completely gets rid of your problems. In two ways they help you. You partially or completely get rid of dopamine, but let me remind you that when you get rid of dopamine completely or partially, you are not completely removing dopamine, but you are reducing to a very large extent the excess dopamine that you have. The excess dopamine that harms you more than the elimination is good for you. The complete release of dopamine is called total dopamine detox, and the partial elimination of dopamine is called limited dopamine detox. Let us start first with total dopamine detox, or the complete elimination of dopamine. In order to be able to do this, you must remove all activities that are related to increasing dopamine for a period of 24 to 48 continuous hours. What you should do during this period is that you remove everything that can supply the dopamine that you have. For example, that you watch the internet, watch YouTube or watch television, watch movies that you like, play any of the games that you might like, listen to any type of music, use the telephone. The use of social media in general, or that you drink any type of narcotic substance, alcohol, or sugar, or eat any type of food that contains artificial materials, for example, processed meat and chips. The needs that are considered manufactured materials are very large and provide the human being with a large number of needs. The second one that you should give up, and which increases dopamine a lot, is sports addiction. There are people who love to play sports very intensely. And you get great euphoria from just exercising a lot, lifting a lot of iron, running a lot, or doing anything that increases what you have. Of course, each one of us has activities that are very different from the routine. One of us thinks in a different way and practices different behaviors. All you have to do is you write down everything you do. Anything you do increases the dopamine you have, and you try to get rid of it during this period. But on the other hand, you must replace these activities with what is called low stimo, or in Arabic, activities that have low motivation. Among the simple activities that you can do is write, walk, and sit with yourself. And think and contemplate all these very simple things that do not require you to do much, but at the same time helps you, as you spend the period between 24 and 48 hours during the period of dopamine elimination. And this brings us to the second type of dopamine elimination, which is partial elimination. The difference between partial elimination and total elimination is that you are in the period of deeply removing a certain thing, something that supplies the dopamine you have. But what you are doing here is that you are extending the period during which you get rid of the need that causes an increase in dopamine. For example, if you are addicted to games, or if you are addicted to YouTube, or if you are addicted to a certain thing and you see that you are addicted to this thing and you are not able to get rid of it, then you try to reduce it. This thing only, but reduce it over a long period, for example for a month or two, or any period that you think is appropriate to get rid of addiction. This is the challenge in getting rid. The portion of dopamine will of course be less than the total elimination, but what you are doing here is that you are focusing on one thing only, and of course one can try partial elimination or total elimination. But in the end you must know that no matter how hard you try to get rid of dopamine, whether partially or completely, you must take the step. The next step that will help you is to focus more on your life. Whether you decide to use total dopamine elimination or partial dopamine elimination and you find one of them works for you so that you can get rid of the motivating needs that make you addicted to activities that waste your time. After all this, you must think that you are making a plan for yourself to continue. In long-term productivity, the author calls this productivity sustainable productivity, the productivity that depends on building good habits and getting rid of bad habits. The writer says that it is very important for a person to achieve sustainable productivity so that he does not go through what is called relapse, which is the idea of returning to old habits again, and sometimes even returning to them in a much worse way. The person must have a daily routine that helps him to continue to be productive. In the long term, this can be done through three things. The first thing is to know which addictive activities are enjoyable for you. Look at the things that can affect you. So-and-so may be addicted to electronic games, and publicly, he may be addicted to pornographic films. Every one of us has some needs that affect him. For this reason, a person needs to know exactly what things affect him, what he is most addicted to, and what he should do after them. The second step is that it places obstacles between yourself and these addictive activities. If you want to know more about this idea, I strongly advise you to watch the book Atomic Habits, the book in which we talked about how you can plan your habits on an ongoing basis. As for the third and final need, it is that you start. Your day is always full of boring activities, boring, unmotivating activities, and this thing is very important because a person always has a certain energy during the day, and this energy works like a battery. If you use it in the first place for fun things, it is very difficult for you to do the boring activities that are important to you. The writer also says on the 3 important tips because it lasts in the long run. The first thing is that you are not who you are. Be hard on yourself. You must know that each one of us has some weak points, some needs that he is greatly addicted to, and he needs to persevere and continue in order to be able to reach the stage where he always gives up bad habits. The second thing is that you practice self-awareness. Take a pen and paper and write down the needs every once in a while. What you are going through, and have an awareness of the things that you are doing so that you can improve yourself. As for the third and final advice, it is that you practice boring activities constantly. Make boring activities part of your routine so that you get used to doing them in the long term. We talked in the episode about 5 important ideas. We talked in the first about what it is dopamine, and then we focused on the dark side for dopamine, and then we talked about the idea of dopamine detox, and the next idea we focused on the difference between total elimination and partial elimination. As for the 5th and final idea, we talked about how you can continue. We talked about sustainable productivity. Dopamine is considered a neurotransmitter, and dopamine has some very important biological functions, such as it helps in movement, helps in memory, in improving a person's mood, and at the same time in learning. Dopamine is classified as a neurotransmitter, but on the other hand, it has some of the functions that hormones do, such as it maintains the level of pressure in the blood, maintains the kidneys, and helps in the production of insulin. But the most important thing that we learned is that dopamine is called the chemical responsible for pleasure in humans, and as we said, dopamine itself is not the substance that makes a person happy, but it is the substance that motivates a person to pursue pleasurable things. Different companies exploit dopamine by using what it is called the reward centers, and depends on the person's need for what is called social validation or social support. Consequently, the person falls victim to the cycle of reward-seeking behavior. Companies like Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and others rely on the so-called variable reward schedule that makes the person always search for pleasure and has a condition. Constant anticipation and the dark side of dopamine are not found only in addiction to social media, but in addiction to anything else that is harmful, such as eating too much or addiction to pornographic films. The term getting rid of dopamine or dopamine detox can also be called the term dopamine fasting, and the term getting rid of dopamine is considered a misleading term because it makes you feel free. You feel that dopamine itself is the problem, but the main problem is the excess dopamine as a result of what a person is exposed to from the so-called sensorimotor input or sensory input. The idea that a person is exposed to a lot of inputs leaves him with an excess of dopamine in his body, and dopamine is a detox. We can divide it into two types: the total elimination of dopamine and the partial elimination of dopamine. The total elimination of dopamine is that you sit from 24 to 48 hours without any activities that stimulate you, without any activities that produce dopamine increases in abundance, and at the same time, you must do activities called allostimulation or low stimulation activities, such as writing, walking, meditating, doing any boring thing, or doing non-stimulating things that produce a very low percentage of dopamine. On the other hand, the partial release of dopamine means that you concentrate on just one thing, you focus on a habit that you are addicted to and try to stop it completely. Stay away from this habit for a month or two, or whatever period you deem appropriate, in order to get rid of the addiction to this habit and thus reduce the excess dopamine as a result of this addiction. All this talk is useless unless we create what is called sustainable productivity. Productivity depends on building good habits and getting rid of habits. The bad thing is that a person goes through what is called relapse, which is the idea that he returns to old bad habits again, but sometimes he returns to them in a much worse way. What you are doing in your daily routine is that you know every day that the addictive activities that you have create obstacles between you and between them, and at the same time, you always start your day with boring activities in order for you to be able to continue in the long run. You must not be harsh on yourself, and you must practice self-awareness through writing. The third and final thing is that you constantly practice boring activities. I hope you benefited and enjoyed the episode. If you liked the episode, don't forget to like and tag this video. It helps a lot in spreading this content, which the largest number of people